but the New World sparrows got kicked out of it, and they're now in their own family called the Passerellidae, and the Emberizidae consists of old world buntings, none of which occur really, I think, at all in the mid-Atlantic. I don't know if there's any vagrant records or not, but so we're looking at these passerellid sparrows. And what I'd like to tell you is, there's some combination of morphological traits that defines what a passerellid sparrow is, but that's the old way of thinking. And in the New World, what makes something a member of the Passerellidae is its DNA. And there really are no morphological traits that are unique to the passerellid sparrows. They tend to be granivorous for a big part of the year. They have small triangular bills. They build nests on the ground. They're cryptic, ground-oriented birds, but none of those traits are unique to them. What's unique, what makes them different from the Emberizids is the fact that their DNA makes them different. So that's just where we're at with that. Now, before we talk about the members of the Passerellidae, I want to talk about a couple things that are not sparrows, that are commonly confused with sparrows. Now, if I talk about all of these, we'd be here all night. That's all I'd have to talk about, because there's a lot of things that aren't sparrows that look like sparrows. But I just want to talk about two of the biggest ones, and this is the first one. If you spend any time on Facebook and What's This Bird or any of these groups, this comes up over and over and over again. I got a new sparrow at my feeder. What is it? Well, if you look at the bill on this bird, you should realize it's not a sparrow. This, of course, most of you know is a female red-winged blackbird. It's not a sparrow. But they're smaller than males. They look completely different from males, and they really are one of the commonest birds that confuses inexperienced people. But for all the things that are not a sparrow, the bill is usually the key indicator. Sparrows, passerellid sparrows, have small, straight-sided, triangular bills for the most part, and things that are not a sparrow do not. The other thing that's not a sparrow is especially confusing because it has sparrow in its name. This is a female house sparrow. The house sparrow is also in a new family called the Passeridae, referred to as the Old World sparrows. So it's not a passerellid. And again, it has a big bill that's kind of curvy. It really doesn't have that little straight-sided triangular bill of a true passerellid sparrow. It is often confused with sparrows. The main mark for the males are pretty obvious. The main mark for the females is just a very plain-looking bird with a big blonde eyebrow. And that big streak behind the eye there is usually your best clue that you're looking at not at least a true New World sparrow. All right, so let's get into the details a little bit. So I promised you this would be a simplified approach. We'll see how that turns out. But there are some elements of simplifying your approach to any group of confusing birds, whether it's female ducks or shorebirds or flycatchers or whatever drives you crazy, fall warblers, gulls. In fact, some of this was stolen from Pete Dunn's book called Gulls Simplified. The first element of this is to break the group into small, manageable groups. Just don't think of them all as sparrows. I'm going to give you 4 groups of sparrows, and so your first job, if you're still struggling with sparrows, is to at least get them into one of those groups, and where there's only 4 or 5 species to deal with instead of a large number. A big part of this too is do not consider rarities. This is a common mistake that, again, beginning birders make. They see a sparrow they can't identify, and the first thing they go to is Cassin sparrow. And yeah, okay, there is at least one Maryland record of Cassin sparrow, but the odds that you're looking at a Cassin sparrow, about 1 in a million or less. So you really don't want to consider rarities at all. Just 99.9% of the birds you're going to see are expected species at that time and place. So forget the brewer sparrow and the Cassin sparrows and the real vagrants. You're not going to be, I've birded for 50 years and I've been lucky enough a half a dozen times to discover a vagrant of that magnitude. So it's just not going to happen. I'm going to identify 3 species among the sparrows for you that are confusion birds, that are quite variable. Instead of going to Cassin sparrow, what I want you to do is go to one of these confusion birds. You see a bird that's like, what the heck is that? These are this little list. Keep this little list in your head and go, well, is it this, this, or this? And that, I think, will help you. Again, to improve your skills, do this idea of lingering over identified birds. So these are considerations that would work on any group of birds, but there's one additional consideration for sparrows, and that's avoid July and August like the plague. And the reason for that is just don't look at sparrows. Don't do it, because you'll just get so confused you can't handle it. And the reason is because of juvenile plumaged birds. So a lot of people use the term juvenile incorrectly. It actually is the first plumage that a bird has after it leaves the nest. And for sparrows, they typically hold this plumage for 4 to 6 weeks. And basically, they all look like pine siskins. They're just streaked all over, messy looking birds, and it'll just drive you crazy. This is the time to go look at shorebirds. They're easy by comparison. So just remember in July and August, and those juveniles have to almost all be identified by jizz. You have to be really familiar with the adults to be able to identify them. So just take a vacation from sparrows. Don't do sparrows in July and August. Okay, one of the other things in terms of this not considering rarities, I want to point out that a lot of bird identification apps have some settings that are very helpful. I'm a huge fan of Sibley in any shape or form, but I particularly love the bird app that Sibley has. And one thing that's really cool about this is that you can actually customize your field guide. So for Sibley, you can, in this case, I've set it to only show birds that occur in Delaware, only show birds of this status, which excludes rare and vagrant birds, and only show birds that show up in October. So if you're looking at the big Sibley, you could see over 50 species of passerellids. But with these settings, I'm down to 16. And that way you're not being confused by brewer's sparrow and rufous-winged sparrow and Bottery's sparrow and all these things you're flipping through. This really helps you focus on the real possibilities. And I really love these settings to use when I use the Sibley app. All right, let's talk about the sparrows then that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about 12 sparrows that I think you're likely to encounter on an everyday basis, and then mention a few others briefly. There are 2 easy sparrows, dark-eyed junco and eastern towhee. All the towhees are in the passerellidae. This is a gray bird with big white outer tail feathers. This is one of our more spectacular birds. So I'm not going to talk about these, but I just wanted to mention them for completeness. They are New World sparrows, technically. So I've broken the sparrows up into 4 groups for you. The first group I've given the very creative name of the streaked all over sparrows. And you're probably going to yourself, well, aren't all sparrows streaked all over? Well, and actually, if you think that, you've just learned something, because no, they're not. And when I say streaked all over, I'm particularly talking about being streaked on the breast. Only a subset of sparrows have streaked breasts. The others in all these other groups have plain breasts. Second group is the zebra-crowned sparrows. These have black and white stripes on the head. The rusty-capped sparrows. And the final group that I won't have a lot of time to talk about are the mouse-like sparrows, based on their behavior. And they're kind of, you don't encounter them in your ordinary everyday birding. They're very habitat specialists, and I will talk a little bit about that. So let's dive right in and talk about these different groups. Let's look at the streaked all over sparrows. These are the song sparrow, Savannah, fox sparrow, Lincoln sparrow, and Vesper sparrow. So again, pretty much if you see a sparrow with extensive streaking on the breast, these are the 5 birds you really have to consider. Okay? And let's go through then a little bit how to tell them apart. So here's a song sparrow. Now, the one thing that I've borrowed from Pete Dunn's Field Guide Companion book is he tries to give all the birds cute names that exemplify their jizz. One of my favorite ones is he calls the blue-gray gnatcatcher the twig fairy, which is just a really creative name. I'm not as creative as Pete Dunn, and I've tried to come up with nicknames that sort of encapsulate the field marks for each one of these birds. So the song sparrow gets the nickname of the mutton chop sparrow. And if you're not old enough to remember what mutton chops really are, these are the mutton chops that I'm referring to. These big sideburns. Okay, and this is the best field mark actually for song sparrow are these big dark malar stripes. And it's actually the only streak sparrow like this that has these big dark malars that really are much darker than the rest of the bird, and they flare a lot at the bottom, and they're, sorry, going the wrong way. They're very distinctive to song sparrows. The other thing that's very distinctive of song sparrows, a lot of people don't realize, is that they have brown streaks on the breast. Of the streak sparrows, they're the only ones that really have sort of these rich medium brown streaks. And they're kind of blurry. They look like they were painted with watercolor, which is also something that's pretty unique to song sparrows. So song sparrow is sort of the most ubiquitous sparrow. It's the one you see all the time. You should really use these marks to help identify them. I'll just briefly mention, if you look in the old Petersons or anywhere else, they often mention the big dark central spot in the breast, which this bird lacks, or is at least not displaying. And the problem with that field mark is that song sparrows can hide it, like this bird is hiding it. And the other streak sparrows often show a central spot called a stick pin, and that's not a particularly good mark for song sparrow. The malar stripes and the breast streaking are much better. This is a really bright savanna sparrow, and I've nicknamed them the spiky-tailed sparrow. They have a short, stiff, spiky tail, but the most prominent field mark is this yellow eyebrow or lores. It would be lovely if they looked like this all the time, but this mark fades a lot. I would say probably 90% of savannas have a yellow eyebrow. So if you look for it, you can usually see it. But another really good mark is this very white breast with fine dark streaks, almost black looking streaks. Again, very different from the brown of the blurry streaks of the song sparrow. And really the unique thing about the savanna is this short spiky tail. It makes it very different from song sparrows, which have the long floppy tail. The next bird on this list is the fox sparrow, and I came up with a very clever nickname for this of fox sparrow. And the reason for this is that we complain a lot about how badly some birds were named, like the red-bellied woodpecker or the ringneck duck. This is almost the perfect name for this bird because the main field mark here is has this gray and rufous color. And if you really think of a gray fox, that's almost exactly what the color of a fox sparrow is. And it's usually very striking. A lot of times people say, well, I think I saw a fox sparrow. And, you know, my usual answer is, no, you didn't. They're a big bird. They're bigger than halfway between a song sparrow and a towhee. And they're just this bright, bright rufous color. But if you are in doubt, the two sort of backup things here are this bicolored bill, very yellow on the bottom and brown on the top, very unlike the gray bill of the other birds in this group. And also the streaks on the breast are arrow-shaped. And this is something not shown by other streak species. So these are two marks that can help you be 100% confident that you're looking at a fox sparrow. But again, linger over these guys because they're big bruisers of sparrows, and usually once you get the feel for them, they're hard to mistake. The next bird on the list is one that a lot of people look for, especially in the fall, although I just had one in my backyard a week ago. Really surprised the heck out of me, but because they're pretty rare in spring. But they're probably the rarest bird that I'm going to talk about is the Lincoln sparrow. And a lot of people are very frustrated with these birds because they say this looks exactly like a song sparrow. But again, when you look at it carefully, it doesn't. And this, I've given it the name the pen-streaked sparrow. because the song sparrow looks like it was painted with watercolors. The Lincoln sparrow looks like it was drawn with pen and ink. And the markings on it are all very fine and crisp. And the real go-to mark is this upper breast with these very fine dark streaks and this buffy breastband. Again, it varies in how bright it is. This is a particularly bright one, but it's usually there. Not again, 90% of them have it. If you really need another mark, it's this buffy malar stripe. It contrasts with the rest of the face, which is usually gray. Again, in song sparrow, the malar and the face will be the same color. So that's another sort of secondary mark for Lincoln sparrow. But again, once you kind of get the hang of how crisp and precisely marked they are, you shouldn't have a whole lot of trouble with Lincoln sparrow. The final streaked bird is a Vesper sparrow. I'm not actually that familiar with their status in your part of the mid-Atlantic, but here in Delaware, they're a pretty rare localized bird. They do breed in a couple of known locations, but it's pretty rare to encounter them in your everyday birding. The thing about Vesper sparrows that everybody knows is that they have white outer tail feathers. And if you haven't seen a lot of Vesper sparrows, you're thinking junco. Well, don't think junco, because juncos have 2.5 white feathers on each side of the tail. Vesper sparrow has a half of a white feather. So the white is not really all that conspicuous. And the best field mark for these guys is the eye-ring. And I've called them the eye-ringed sparrow. And this is a particularly nice example of a very white eye-ring, very prominent, that jumps out at you. The other good mark is the face pattern. These two large dark spots here, which aren't really connected to the eye, is a good mark. What I really love about field guides is actually several field guides refer to the long spur-like face pattern of Vesper sparrow. And I'm always thinking to myself, well, so somebody that can't identify a Vesper sparrow knows what a long spur's face pattern is. Yeah, okay, that's a good idea. So yeah, it's just, and just one person came up with this, and of course everybody else copied it. But what it means is these two separated large spots on the face. There's sometimes you can see a rusty shoulder, but that's quite often concealed, so not your best mark. So anyway, those are the streaked all over sparrows. Now we'll talk about the zebra crown sparrows, which are relatively easy. We've got two species here, the white-throated and the white-crowned. And again, initially people think of these as very similar, but I hope to show you they're actually quite different. The white-throated sparrow, of course, one of our most common birds, period, especially of course, in the winter. They're not here in the summer, neither are white crowns. When you get a white throat that looks like this, they fall in the easy category. They're very easy to identify, but I'm going to call them the dirty sparrow because they don't all look like this. You know, when you get these birds, they've got this spectacular head pattern, the bold stripes, the yellow lores, the nice white throat. They're easy. But most white-throated sparrows don't look like this. There's a lot of variability, and it's more common to see a white throat that looks like this. And they have kind of this streaked, dirty-looking breast, and they're just kind of a smudgy, overall-looking bird. And the real way to go here is just, again, they still have the head pattern. You still have the bold stripes. You still have the yellow lores. You still have the white throat. It's just muted. It's harder to see, but definitely when you come across a bird that looks kind of smudgy and dirty and mixed up, one of the things to pop out of your head, especially if it's a larger bird, is an immature white-throated sparrow. Now, if we go look at the white-crowned sparrow, this one I've actually given almost the opposite nickname to of immaculate sparrow. They're just one of the neatest, cleanest looking birds that there is. They have this immaculate gray breast from chin to tail. That's very different from white-throated sparrow. And they also, of course, have this pink bill, which is the other field mark that helps you identify white-crowned sparrows. But it's one of my favorite birds. I did happen to do my PhD thesis on them. That might be one reason, but I really love the look of the immaculate white-crowned sparrow. Now, the immature white-crowned sparrows are quite a bit different, but I'm actually going to put them in a different category. Now, we're going to talk about the rusty-capped sparrows now, the last of the three groups of sparrows, which has the chipping sparrow, the field sparrow, the swamp sparrow, which are the three common species. Also has the American tree sparrow, another one of my favorite sparrows. And I put the immature white-crowned sparrow in here because if you don't recognize it when you see it as a white-crowned, you're going to put it into this rusty-capped sparrow group. So the chipping sparrow, this is what they look like now. If you're seeing chipping sparrows, they're beautiful, easy to identify birds. And I've called them the eyeliner sparrow because their big field mark here is this black eye line, which runs all the way to the bill, the only sparrow that has this mark. Okay. But in breeding plumage like this bird with the black bill, the rusty cap, the black eye line, they're relatively easy. But this is another one of our confusion species, and in the winter, they can just be nasty. So here's a chipping sparrow in the winter. This is the kind of thing that causes people to not do sparrows, I think. This individual I actually photographed, unsure of what species it was until I went and looked carefully at the photograph. But again, if you look carefully, there's that eye line, and it runs all the way to the bill. So it can be muted, it can be obscured, it can be hard to see, but it's almost always there in a chipping sparrow. And even when they get in these crazy brown mixed up winter plumages, you can usually pull them out by that eye line. So that brings us to the field sparrow, one of our most beautiful sparrows, I think, in a lot of ways. And I've called this the baby-faced sparrow. The big field mark here is, unlike chipping sparrow, it has this blank-faced look. There are very few markings around the eye. That's what gives it sort of this baby-faced appearance, in addition to the fact that they really can be almost pink. So that's really the best field mark there. Sorry, I did want to go back and just say the pink bill is the other thing that's often cited for field sparrow as being a good mark. That's great in the breeding season, but the chipping sparrow I just showed you in winter has a pink bill. So the lack of markings around the eye, I really think, is the main field mark for field sparrows. Now, immature white-crowned sparrows, if you have no size reference for them, I've called them the rusty striped sparrow. They really look like a giant field sparrow. They've got the pink bill, they've got the rusty cap, but they do have an eye line, so they're not really blank-faced like field sparrows are. But once you get to know these two species, I mean, the white-crowned is probably twice the size of a field sparrow. Field sparrows are very small. White-crowns are much larger. So you really shouldn't confuse them very often. And again, the immature white-crowns are this immaculate, very neat-looking bird, nothing like an immature white-throated sparrow. So hopefully that will help you identify immature white-crowns. Now we come to my least favorite sparrow, because this one has confused me in the field probably more than any other. They're the rusty wing sparrow, because this big rusty wing panel is present on most of them, and there's no wing bars here. It's just a rusty greater coverts and flight feathers. Usually makes them pretty obvious. They usually are sort of a darker looking sparrow and have kind of this dark gray face. But I sort of scoured the internet for kind of the nastiest looking swamp sparrow I could find, because they have a lot of seasonal variability. And this is the one I came up with. And I'm like, okay, good luck. These guys in the winter, it kind of has a streaked breast. It kind of looks, they can be confused with Lincoln sparrows. They can be confused with white-throated sparrows. One of the things that is distinctive about swamp sparrows is they have a fairly long bill, and it's usually gray. And so in all plumages, of course, that can be fairly distinctive. They also have an unmarked throat. That's the best way to tell them from Lincoln sparrow, when you get one that has kind of a Lincoln sparrow look to it. And again, 90% of them have the rusty wing panel, so that's going to help you. But this is definitely a bird to think about. If you think you're looking at some rare, vagrant, weird sparrow, think to yourself, why isn't this a swamp sparrow? Because they're the source of a lot of confusion. The last bird, again, a bird that's seems to me to be becoming rarer and rarer over the decade that I've lived in the mid-Atlantic. This is the American tree sparrow. Again, a very clean, neat bird. And this one I call the stick pin sparrow because of the sparrows with a plain breast, the only other one that has this dark spot in the middle is the vagrant lark sparrow. But of the more regularly seen sparrows, if you get the large stick pin on the plain gray breast, that's the best mark for a tree sparrow. But it has other good field marks. It has a rusty eye line that goes all the way to the bill. Again, it's not black like a chipping sparrow. It has this lovely bicolored bill. And interestingly, after I gave this talk a couple times to other groups, I got people sending me pictures of swamp sparrows, insisting that they had to be tree sparrows. And you can find swamp sparrows that have a kind of a stick pin, kind of a rusty eye line, kind of a bicolored bill, but they don't have white wing bars. So if you think you've got a tree sparrow, one of the things probably to look for, one of the wing bars is hidden by the twig here, but is to focus in on the white wing bars. To me, they don't look very much alike, but apparently, again, when you're kind of at the field mark stage, swamp sparrows, again, which can look like almost anything, can be a source of confusion. So that brings us to the last group, which I unfortunately don't have enough time to talk about because these are a little bit difficult, but I'll just go through the ones that are regular, at least in the mid-Atlantic. In fields, and by fields I mean grassy fields that don't have a lot of shrubbery or second growth or bushes, you'll find a grasshopper sparrow, which is nicknamed the buffy-breasted sparrow, which is probably the best field mark for them. They look like buff-breasted sandpipers in sparrow form. The other three species are found in salt marshes, and I mean literally where their feet are wet in a salt marsh. They're rarely found. They might be in a bush on the edge of a salt marsh, but they're really, again, these guys really stick to their habitats. Very common bird, certainly here in Delaware, is a seaside sparrow. It's all gray, not with yellow lores, not that hard to identify. But then you get the pair of birds here, the salt marsh and the Nelson sparrow. Again, usually seen mostly for a couple weeks in spring and a couple weeks in fall, but they do winter and a few salt marsh breed. Orange-faced sparrows, the salt marsh is nice, sharp streakings on the breast. The Nelson's has relatively blurry streakings. But again, if you're out and about just looking at sparrows in a field or anywhere, you're not in one of these habitats, you're not going to see these species. So you really don't have to consider them. So to go over the simplified approach, I've broken these guys into small manageable groups, three really that you have to consider on a regular basis, and a fourth if you happen to be in one of those habitats. Don't consider rarities. Keep the three confusion birds, which are white-throated sparrow, chipping sparrow, and swamp sparrow, in the back of your head. Every time you have a bird you can't identify, why isn't it a white-throat? Why isn't it a chipping? Why isn't it a swamp sparrow? And remember to linger over these identified birds. And really, I'm not kidding about July and August. They're not any fun. So I hope at the beginning of this talk, if you were one of the people that sort of started with this impression of a sparrow, I hope I've transformed your view of sparrows into something more like this, where you realize there are consistent differences that allow you to identify these. But they are a frustrating group, and I encourage you not to get frustrated, but really to have fun. I mean, to me, one of the biggest thrills about birding is our identification challenges, and there certainly are some in this group of birds. So I really enjoy trying to figure out sparrows a little bit, and I hope I've gotten you a better start on that and made it somewhat easier. And I'm going to put my email address up here. If you want to email me, I have a PDF of this was actually a shortened version of this talk. I do have a full hour-long version